Well, I was about to say good morning, everyone, but I gather you've been going for a little while over there.
Ja.
Inte här inne, du får sätta dig närmare i så fall.
Well, good morning from New England in North America here. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Graham and I are excited to be here. So I'll do a little intro of the project and the two of us, and then we'll go through each of the plants, each of the three plants that we focused on, and have time at the end for Q&A as well. So we, Graham and I, were in north central Vermont, in New England, here in the U.S., and we live just outside Montpelier, the capital of Vermont, and we farmed and we raised beef cattle and ran a permaculture edible landscaping company together for a while.
Aaron, sorry.
Yep.
Can you bring your microphone a bit closer so we can hear you louder?
Closer. Is that any better?
Not really. We can hear you, but we have to be very focused and concentrated.
Okay. Let me just think for a second here. Is that any better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm a little closer and speaking up. Excellent. So I was just saying, Graham and I are in north central Vermont, outside of the capital Montpelier, and for a while we ran an edible permaculture landscaping company together and raised grass-fed beef, and we ran a couple grant projects here focused on perennial vegetables. We started with one grant that was focused. Oh no. Oh, there we go. We started with one grant focused on sea kale, which was sort of our top crop, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we had this was with these are both grants that came through the USDA through various programs, the Department of Agriculture here. And we had a second grant where we focused on sea kale, but added also Publicia tamnoides, the spinach vine, and Hostas, looking at their commercial potential. So I'll just say briefly, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, but been in Vermont for a while, and I worked in the nonprofit sector and the farm sector and the permaculture world for a long time, and currently I'm going back for a graduate degree focused on agroforestry. So I hope to be working more on these crops. Graham, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all over there. We very much appreciate being invited here. Actually, I lived in Copenhagen for a short period of time with a family there, and I visited a few times, and just excited to see you all in that part of the world. So like Aaron said, we focus on these grants, these crops, and what I'm currently doing now, I continue to raise grass-fed and finished beef, working on implementing agroforestry crops as a part of that. We have 2 newborn twins here, so our life has really shifted. We also have a 3.5-year-old, so there's a lot of parenting involved right now. And I work at an organization also called Rural Vermont, which is a member of the National Family Farm Coalition, and through that, member of La Via Campesina. And we work on agricultural policy, organizing, education around equity in agriculture. So that's part of the work I'm doing now. I'll pass it back to Aaron to take you into our research.
Excellent. Thanks, Graham. So we're going to move through our couple crops here, just a little bit of framing. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these books. Some of the inspiration for our work on the grant came from both colleagues here in presentations seen at conferences in person, and then also the work of Eric and Dave Jackie with the Edible Forest Gardens, Martin Crawford's work, and Stephen Barstow's excellent survey of plants from around the world. I'm sure many of you kind of know these. We were interested in perennial vegetables, in the midst of sort of grant programs that are often focused on annual vegetables, or if they are perennial focused, they're focused on sort of known perennials, berries, orchards, apples, maple syrup production here in our part of the world. But we were interested in perennial vegetables. They have a harvest window earlier in the season. From a sort of commercial farm perspective, they're giving a yield when most of the farmers are, still just, babying tomatoes in the greenhouse and just getting stuff out into the field. You're getting a marketable crop. More work initially, but less maintenance over time. We're interested in minimizing soil disturbance, for carbon sequestration and soil health. Many of the crops that we've come across, as I'm sure you know, are also pest and disease resistant. We'll talk a little bit about that with our experience, climate adaptation, and our initial research during these trials, and then also prior, was that the perennials tend to have a higher nutrition, and we're also interested in their role in farm viability in terms of diversification of crops and enterprises, crop resilience to biological natural factors, new market potential, and also utilizing marginal spaces on the farm that may not be able to be utilized for an annual tillage crop, or something along those lines. Some of the barriers to adoption that we've identified for perennial crops through our work here is first and foremost, familiarity to growers, consumers, and technical service providers. If people don't know how to grow these plants and cook them and eat them, then it'll be difficult to get them out. We tried to address that through some of our work. They do take committed bed space. If you grow spinach and it doesn't go very well, you can just till that bed under and grow something else the following year. So this is a bit of a longer term commitment. The plants are limited in their availability, their accessibility, and sometimes are more expensive than plants that are commonly used in the farm trade currently. In the early years, we have limited yields, so you're kind of planting and waiting some time to get that economic return coming back to you. And then there's just a lack of research and enterprise guides and commercial cropping of these crops. So we always suggest to growers to test these on a smaller scale before going bigger. So our first crop we started with was sea kale, Crambe maritima. We picked sea kale because it's easy to grow. We knew we had colleagues in the area, including Eric, who had been growing this for a long time. We knew their patches were productive, although we didn't have data on how productive. And the broccoli of this plant looks like broccoli rabe, which farmers are familiar with and consumers are familiar with. So our hypothesis was that this plant would be kind of an easy sell, an add-on to a vegetable farmer who already has a CSA, a community supported agriculture, or is taking food to market. So we grew sea kale on 2 different sites, probably about 50 miles apart here. Our first site here was on an edible, small, diversified, edible perennial farm that a friend of ours has, where they grow both food and also nursery crops. And I would say this is probably our favorite method of establishing a larger row. We tried tillage, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in this scenario, we established a row. You can see in the top left, we basically went from field to planting in a couple hours. This row that is pictured is a little over, I think this was 120 feet long or so. So in this case, we experimented with no tillage. So we ran a broad fork down the row for decompaction, spread lime and compost. And in the center there, you can see center top, we're marking out the locations of the plants. In the upper right here, we have put the plants in the ground. every 2.5 to 3.5 feet we did in this particular case. This is sea kale. And we just weeded a little bit of a hole, put a little compost in where each plant went, and then tucked our nursery landscaping fabric here. That's a 3-foot row on each side. We tucked it in right against the plants to suppress the weeds and let that grow for the season. And then in the bottom left here, this is the first fall. So this was planted in the spring, grow for the year. And then in the fall, we peeled the landscape fabric back. We unpinned it along the center where it was tucked in around the plants. We unpinned that one side, rolled it back, and then pinned it again. So in the bottom center, you can see that it's covering the pathways now, and then we spread mulch. And this was a really great, we think this could be used on a larger scale on a lot of farms. It was super easy, no-till, and suppresses the weeds really nicely.
And just quickly, that picture on the bottom right-hand side is that following spring. So like Aaron said, the fall after spring planting on the far left, after being mulched that fall, and then in the right is a planting at that site that following spring. So that's the second year's growth after the tarp is folded back. You can see the wood chip mulch right under it.
Thanks, Graham. These are just some more pictures of this particular sea kale planting. You can see this really took care of the weeds quite nicely and minimized maintenance. Maintenance was a couple hours spread out over the season in most cases, maybe an hour visit with 2 people 2 or 3 times throughout the season to kind of rip weeds back. And then the only fertility treatments that were received here by the plants were mulch and compost on an ongoing basis. And the pathways were, some seasons they were cardboard and wood chipped for a sheet mulch. In the picture bottom, on the bottom one from the right there, you can see a cover crop next to the sea kale flowers. So pretty easy maintenance after that. And that was one of our goals, was to figure out how to minimize maintenance for the farmers, because as we know, time is money. Yeah, so propagation, we tried a bunch of different methods. And the message we wanted to send was the easiest that we found was taking chunks of roots and sticking them in a nursery bed and then letting them root and then planting those out from there. Plants are very easy to propagate, which was another goal of ours for working with commercial operations. You know, once, if a farmer is limited financially or being able to find the plants, putting, 10 sea kale plants in the ground, and within a couple seasons, they could propagate many hundreds of plants from that and plant out a very large patch. This is just another patch of ours. Takeaway message, just tilling the field in and then planting perennials on a farm can be very difficult because there's a lot of weed management. And because we're in perennials, we don't have the same ability to just, till every year and start over again in terms of the weeds. So I think that's our main takeaway there. And in the upper right, you can see Graham holding a plant that's probably 2 seasons in the ground, and it is giant. These plants, they want to grow, they're easy to grow, they're drought resistant. We watered them when we planted, and they received no further water after that time. Just some more shots of the sea kale. I'm going to keep moving because we have a bunch to get through here. So the sea kale yields, we recorded yields from 3 different sites. This was in the 3rd and 4th years. So these are fairly mature plants, but they still had room to grow. We were getting 1.8 to 3.7 pounds of just broccolis. This is just harvesting the sort of marketable broccolis from the plant, which translated basically to 4,700 to 9,700 pounds per acre of broccolis. And this is on spacing of little under 3 feet between plants and 6 feet between rows. So quickly here you can see these are low, high, and average yields of sea kale compared with annual broccoli and asparagus from New England, our region here in the US. And in sort of the mid-range at the bottom here, you can see sea kale was at a little over 7,000 pounds an acre. Broccoli was at 7,500 pounds an acre, and asparagus, which is one of the closest plants we have in terms of being a perennial, was at 2,800 pounds an acre. So we're very excited about the potential of sea kale yields, knowing also that we need to be trialing this on a larger scale. So the potential here, to sort of wrap up sea kale, we do need more data on larger field trials. You know, what is this like when we plant it on a quarter acre or a full acre scale? We saw high yields and also room to grow as plants mature. These plants are also, there's room to breed the plants. These are basically unbred, you know, varieties. So there's potential there to increase yield. And we saw very little, almost no pest or disease pressure on these plants. And as I said, gave them very little in terms of fertility. So I think that's what we'll say about that. We've got a couple more plants to cover. Sea kale, let's see, a couple food picks here. Folks noted that the stems were very similar to broccoli stems, but maybe even more juicy and sweet. And people also noted that it was very, very similar to annual broccoli, which was our goal, right? To start with a plant that was recognizable to farmers and recognizable to consumers. Moving slow here. And this was just a shot. We had a food writer come and harvest some sea kale, and she made a very, this is making me hungry for breakfast here, caramelized onions, garlic, and cheese with sea kale. Now we're on to spinach vine.
Thanks, Aaron. The last thing I want to say about sea kale is just that we focus a lot on the broccolis, but as I've been growing the plant more and more, you know, I think the managing for ongoing production of the very, very young kale leaves before they've gotten too fibrous or the waxy coatings really developed is also a really interesting commercial opportunity and just basic home food production opportunity to explore more. All right, spinach vine, Blitzia tamnoides. Aaron didn't mention, we're in about, I think, zone 4A and 4B in our parts of Vermont. So we're in relatively cold temperate regions. Aaron, you can just go ahead, slide ahead. So germination and propagation of spinach vine, I think, you know, this, we cultivated from seed. It was very easy. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see nursery crates filled with soil. These seeds needed stratification, which, you know, a period of freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing. So basically in the winter time, I put them out in these flats. I covered them with snow, sometimes even just left them out when there wasn't snow left on the ground, and got pretty decent rates of germination. You can see separated out the plants. We also tried propagating in just individual flats. Go ahead, Aaron. You can see we planted out, sort of like sea kale, we played with a few different spacing options, and also clumping it, planting a long row versus planting like a fuller bed. And I think some of the questions in terms of what's the commercial harvest opportunity and why do we choose this crop? Again, you know, it has a taste and to some extent of an appearance which is relatively familiar to people. It's not the normal type of leaf people see in a salad, but it's very palatable. We had a person come up into the garden and pick a leaf and said, wow, this is even better than spinach, just eating it fresh. So it was a flavor that person thought about. It was something they were excited about. It has opportunities for both managing low at the ground in terms of like recut a number of times in the spring for that fresh new growth. And for that reason, we thought, well, maybe this could be planted densely across a bed, almost like greens in a normal bed where you'd plant a bed thickly and then cut and cut again. But you could also manage for a vining crop where you'd be putting a trellis up and harvesting leaves individually off throughout the season. You can go ahead, Aaron. I just want to double down on what Aaron said. You know, we experimented with sort of these quote unquote no-till crops using fabric or landscape, something to essentially smother weeds before we planted. And then we did a traditional sort of tillage like you saw. And the regrowth of weeds in the tillage bed was a real problem. And if we weren't staying on top of them, it led to a lot of root damage in weeding of perennial crops and led to sort of, issues with those crops having to catch up over time. So I would just encourage you to think about weed control very deliberately with crops like these. That picture was just giving you a picture of the scale. This is early spring. I don't have a date on this picture. That's a quart-sized mason jar. And you can see basically we were playing with cutting. So just at this point where you have these very young, fresh growth, you could even cut earlier. Go ahead, Aaron. There's a handful of those very young sort of spring greens. And these could be, chopped up fresh in a salad. They're sort of that tasty, or they could be, pan seared or put in a stir fry of some sort. You can garble them from the stem. You take the leaves off the stem, and because the stem is perhaps a little bit more stringy at times, but those are some culinary options for that. Go ahead, Aaron. This is just us, how we weighed it out in the field and how we were bagging it. I think, presentation is always something to consider for, our real goal was like pushing at that commercial edge for small farms. Is there an opportunity here for people? So like, again, thinking about how it could be presented and sold to people. Yeah, you can go ahead, Aaron. So that picture, this is our trellis. It didn't work out very well. This is a smooth, steel wire that we had a bunch of and we decided to use. I think experimenting with different trellis options is important. Vertical strands of trellis, and not something as smooth would allow the vines to climb more. They can grow substantially throughout the year if they're not cut back. And I think for us, we came out of this feeling like the spring growth, cutting it close to the ground, filling a bed, treating it like a spring green is really effective. We had less of success sort of managing it throughout the season as a tall growing plant on a trellis. Go ahead, Aaron. This is goes to seed pretty quickly. That's sort of the message on this one. If they're not, it still doesn't affect the taste too much. It doesn't get extremely bitter, but it's part of something to consider. Next slide. So we mentioned lessons and questions. Trellising, I just mentioned that. There's a question about when you want to harvest this crop and the product that is going to come from that, as we talked about. Density of planting related to that. I think everything else here I really mentioned. It does have very vigorous growth, but again, that sensitivity to weeds and weeding is more important with this crop than the sea kale. The sea kale really has so much vitality as a plant. It will just keep growing. This plant, we saw a lot more dieback when we had to affect the root system through weeding. On to the next one, Aaron. Hosta. Everyone was always amazed when I told them that we were researching Hosta as an edible and that it was an edible plant because everyone's very familiar with it as landscape ornamental. We were focusing on these young shoots, more or less a little unfurled. I think I preferred them best when they were like this tucked up. They get a little more unfurled. These other flavors of acridity and bitterness, I think, can come out a little bit more in the leaves. Go ahead, Aaron. Hostas. So as you can see here, there is a long history internationally of these being eaten. So many species, and this was one of the challenge for us is like, well, how there's hundreds, if not thousands, of Hosta cultivars. What are we going to choose? So go ahead, Aaron. We basically chose to try a bunch of different types from, variegated and more ribbed to larger to smaller. This is, it tastes and look a lot like asparagus. It's a great picture in that respect. Aaron, can you go back a slide real quick? There was something I missed. Oh yes, the growing in shade. I just wanted to mention that. And that's one of the reasons we also thought this was a unique crop. Now you can pop ahead again, Aaron. As producers who are, one of the main barriers to production that wasn't on our slide is access to land. And if you're working with small amounts of land, leased land or land that you have deeded to yourself, crops that might be able to take advantage of a space that's usually considered marginal, like a shady space, might be really effective in a farm. So that was one of the things that really turned us on about hostas as well. This is a hosta nursery we visited where they're growing a lot of shade-loving crops in a high pine overstory. Go ahead, Aaron. We planted one hosta bed here in sort of a shady chestnut patch on our friend's farm. So Aaron and I don't have our own farm. That was part of the issue of us as researchers too, is maintaining crops at other farms. So this is the chestnut patch. You can go ahead, Aaron, forward more. You can see there's some bigger varieties there and some smaller varieties of hosta. The hosta has big leaves like sea kale. You know, it has some capacity to self-mulch a little. It certainly does not mean you don't need to weed it. It will also get crowded out by weeds. Go ahead, Aaron. And that planting you're seeing there is a nursery setting again. So these are all nursery settings that we were getting our propagation material from. Go ahead, Aaron. Yeah, so these are just all different varieties that we were looking at to choose from. You can keep going. Pretty easy to harvest. You can clip right at the ground. You can even sort of, if you get it right, you can snap it right off where the bulb is essentially. This is us planting in that tilled area. The hostas are one of those plants that is more expensive to source, whereas the sea kale, it readily propagates. You can quickly get yourself to having a lot of propagation material. Same with the spinach vine. It seeds itself. It sets its own seed. The seed is very easy to propagate. Hosta is expensive. You know, it's mostly an ornamental plant. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. And it sort of grows more slowly over the years too. We found, whereas sea kale and the spinach vine will grow into large plants. Hosta takes a number of years to really grow into a mature patch. Here you see it at that planting on the left, and on the right, I think that's probably the next spring, early summer. Keep going, Aaron. So here you see sort of the culinary prep and the different varieties. You see some with variegation, some with a little more of a ribbed texture, some more smooth, some more sort of held together, some more unfurled. And these are sort of the questions that we have, and I think that would be good to have some more culinary research around internationally and experimenting with seeing what's happening around the world, but also then seeing what makes sense to people here. So we have 15 varieties, like Aaron pointed out there. This is about just showing you some sizes of the different varieties. One's almost, 10 inches, one's 6 inches. Sorry, I did not have the metric on in my head for you all. Go ahead, Aaron. Some really small ones there. Just keep going through these because we're running lower on time. This is I don't know where Aaron got this picture, but there's an idea of how some people are preparing this in very fancy little environments. So some lessons. This was another one where the farmer whose site was at he loved this crop. He was so surprised at how delicious the hosta shoots were. To me, it's very much like a bok choy type. You have a thick, juicier, bulbous stem part, and then this sort of unfurling top, leafier green part. Some of them we found more bitter and mildly acrid. I think that varies depending on the cooking time as well. As I said, they're more expensive to source than other subject plants we had. We've heard about nematode diseases and viruses and the importance of nursery testing. We didn't experience any issues with that. As we said, slower to establish. And we did experiment a little with full sun hosta just to see, how sensitive are they to full sun? How does it affect production? And very much worth just continuing to plant in the shade. There, they got sunburn. They didn't like that. So, yep, that's that for that. Where are we at now? Yes, so like I said, we're in a cold temperate climate. Here we are in the late fall, and just looking at how these plants are affected by frost and freeze. So you can see the sea kale has that sort of a little bit resilience to the frost and freeze. At this point, it might still be putting out some new young leaves, which might still be palatable. The spinach vine is pretty much toasted on the left side here. It's harder to even see. And the hosta on the right has really wilted at this point in the season. You can keep going through. Yeah, this is sort of that fall period again, seeing the impact of frost and freeze on these plants. Go ahead, Aaron. And so part of our grants, we had these research deliverables and materials, and we're happy to send these out to the organizers of this event and make them available to you all. They're available on the internet. We have a commercial crop going guide for each species, although I think Aaron and I realized that we have to finalize the hosta one still the other day. So that should be out there shortly. Connections to the grantors' web pages here, to our final report, to an article written by a food writer about this work. I think that's largely it. Oh, the work with Eric around the nutritional analyses that Eric was presenting on earlier. And yeah.
Yeah, I think we'd be happy to share these slides and also share out the more detailed information that we have there too. This is just
Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron.
this is our send off slide to take us into Q&A.
Okay, we have some questions from the chat. To start with, do you know other people or projects in North America that grow perennial vegetables in more large scale or more commercial?
Sure. So you know, one of the reasons we were inspired to do this project is because there really is not, you know, there's really not a whole lot of experienced folks working on this, and ours was just a small piece of what we hope will be a larger trend. I am not really aware of folks working with sort of more new or less known crops sort of along the lines of ours on a larger scale. Part of our goal was to get plants out onto farms, and we have I don't know, probably 8 or 10 growers at this point that have gotten sea kale in particular from us and are planting them out on their operations. So we're gonna keep on that and hope that will continue to grow. But I am not aware of other efforts on sort of a larger scale outside of like the permaculture gardeners and the permaculture nurseries and folks kind of doing that. Yeah, I do know that sea kale is being picked up by more nurseries. Fedco, which is one of the big seed catalogs for sort of homesteaders and gardeners and small farms here, has started selling spinach vine seed. So they're starting to make their way around a little bit, but there's not a lot of work that I've seen sort of specifically aimed at commercialization.
And I was just gonna put some numbers, like Aaron said, our goal has been to distribute some of these plants as much as possible to producers. And sea kale has really been the one that people expressed interest in the most. And I think we had a couple farmers plant each source 50 to 100 root cuttings each. So there are some people who are taking a somewhat substantial amount of space, even if it's a couple hundred row feet of space in their small farms, to really plant this out and see where it goes. So to me, it's heartening that some of these small farms are committing some space and are really going to try this. I think some of the things that really people love the idea about with sea kale in particular was a very early broccoli crop, and the lack for us around here, there are pests and diseases which affect young plants in that family of plants, from powdery mildew on the young seedlings to flea beetles consuming the actual plants. And if anyone who's grown sea kale, one of the things I found really interesting about it is its resistance to flea beetles in particular. You can see them on the plants at times, but that sort of white, coating, that sort of waxy coating that gets on the mature leaves of the sea kale really seems to protect it from those critters.
So let's see. In this crop guide, will you talk about which varieties you used and which one was the top best, tastiest, like for Hosta? Or do you have that? Mm-hmm.
We do have that in there for Hosta. Yeah, I mean, the takeaway for us for Hosta was that pretty much everything we tasted was delicious. There's some more, I think, variability, like Graham was saying, in cooking time. I think there's also some, I've talked to different folks who have eaten it who have sort of like different takes on the bitterness or whether it has a little bit of an acridity or not. And I think we have, there's different genetics for humans with bitterness and taste and things. So there's definitely more to go. But the main takeaway is that everything we tasted was delicious with the Hostas, with some variability in there. And the sea kale and spinach vine have no varieties to taste between at this point. But there are a few species of Hosta in particular that we tried to focus on based on the writing from Stephen Barstow in his Around the World in 80 Plants. He identified a few particular species of Hosta, which he said, based on his research, were the most kind of palatable ones, or the ones grown specifically for food. I would be really interested to do a survey in Eastern Asia where the plants are and have been grown for a long time commercially, it would be really interesting to visit and check out varieties and taste things. And I know transporting varieties across borders can be complicated, but maybe someone can stick some of the best Hosta bulbs in their sock or something and bring them through and start propagating them around. So.
And I have one response to that I realized we forgot to mention in here. And this, as Aaron says, we don't have sort of named cultivars of sea kale or spinach vine that we were working with, but there were a couple different clear phenotypes in the sea kale. So we had some that were more purple when they were growing young, and they held themselves closer to the ground in the wintertime. So like the actual crown of the plant at the ground sort of is firm and tucks itself in. And then there's another phenotype which tend to be more light green in the young leaves, and the crown tend to have little like spindles coming off of it, like it would come up above the ground more. And what I found, and especially as we've grown it out a couple of years since this research, is that the purple variety with the harder crown that hugs closer to the earth, it overwinters here in this climate far more readily than the one that has the smaller pieces of plant material that come up from the crown over winter. That tends to see more rot, and some of the plants have actually died that I've had, but those ones that hug the ground again is the phenotype that I see to be most resilient to the climate here.
Do we have any questions in the room?
Too late in the day.
Yeah. Då ger vi en varm applåd.
Yes.
Thank you.